Well, thanks, Greg, and hi, you guys. Yeah, literally, I get like so many, what is it, so many dispensations because I have not had any time to practice this at all. But, this is something I've done. I have a lot of clients who are sort of starting out. They're either greenfield with their Power BI. They may be very mature in terms of data, but they don't really know how to look at the big picture. And I'm always kind of going up to the big picture view of things. So what I'm going to show you is a bunch of stuff that I've created to help. Okay, so I've got to share my, okay, hold on one sec. That I made in Lucidchart, because Lucidchart is like my favorite thing in the world. And so this is, you ignore the fact that it doesn't have a cover slide, but what I'm going to be doing is going to show you a lot of different ways of thinking when you're just starting out, not even when you're just starting out, when you're considering an enterprise Power BI, deployment, basically. So we'll be hopping from kind of the roles. Some of these slides, some of what I have built has been built off of stuff that's in Microsoft, but just kind of rendered in ways that are, I think, more digestible. And I'm going to just start with, let me just present. I'm also going to be showing off my Zoom It skills because I'm like really into what you can do with Zoom It now. So first thing I'm going to show you is basically there's three kind of approaches to kind of how you're going to do your Power BI. And I am going to encourage you to interrupt, by the way. This is going to be definitely dialoguing back and forth. But basically, what we tend to end up with is a lot of people in the corporate BI approach. And actually, I've talked to, I had a great conversation with both Leanne at Smarsh, who was on one of the slides earlier, and Matt Mitchell, about how does do they consider themselves corporate BI, IT managed service, or business led. So these buckets are really useful, and they kind of describe themselves as corporate BI. I tend to end up in organizations that end up being corporate BI, but it isn't what you're classically thinking of corporate BI. It's basically that it's IT that's handling a lot of the build out of the reports. They are the ones that are doing what Mark did. If Mark is still on, it was really fantastic. Thank you very much. But they're basically building both the back end logic and the front end tools, for business user to consume. They are also supporting all elements of the solution, including creating workspaces, including making all of the decisions about what kind of permissions people are going to have. This is there's some real advantages to that kind of, and I don't even think top-down approach. This was kind of from a deck of Microsoft where they bucketed as top-down. I wouldn't necessarily classify it as that. I would say it's kind of heavily IT controlled. So as I'm talking, I want you to kind of think about what does your world look like. At the other end of the spectrum is, hold on, this is my, is this sort of that it's completely happening in the business. So it might be that, basically this is a lot of analysts doing literally all the build out. What Mark just represented was perfect example of an analyst just having to get it done, building your own ETL effectively, tremendous freedom. This is kind of the Uber compensation for being bottlenecked by IT, that you actually, you just build it yourselves. The analyst builds them yourself. And you are actually, and there's some organizations that are, enormous organizations where the kind of going mode is that this is the definition of self-service BI, that people ought to be able to pull data from, they know their data, they own their data, they ought to be able to pull it, build their own solutions. So this is really where business people are literally, in this point right here, which is what does the BI user end up doing? This is where the business people are building out their models. My own experience is that is challenging. That is really fraught with possibilities for Excel hell. That's what data flows would prevent if you don't have a data warehouse. And I would say it may be great for your on-ramp to get your organization bought into Power BI, so that you really can see, wow, here's the power, here's people that are analysts with Excel skills that can basically do a lot of this. But my own experience is that it gets deep pretty quickly. So I would just be, kind of surprised if that can really work that well. But maybe maybe there's some smaller organizations where that is totally viable. Also, you have to remember everything you touch, permissions wise, generally, even if you want an AD group, is going to have some kind of IT interaction. So, but this is the kind of nirvana. What they're calling top down, bottom up, where they're kind of, and this is what I'll be showing some slides on later, where you've really got these predefined governed data sources. Those could be certified data sets. Those could be SSAS models. We'll look at a visual of that. And the IT and business users, the people who are owning it is IT owns the data and the models, and the business user owners own the reports. I mean, it's interesting because in my experience of working with this sort of red side of the spectrum, there's no point at which business does not own reports. I mean, they're the ones that are sort of saying what they want to see on it, but they're not maybe necessarily held accountable. Maybe that's what they're, talking about here. They would be accountable if the DAX is wrong. I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but the idea here is that the business user, the analyst, is creating the reports and dashboards. So my own experience of this world is that that is problematic to do for a number of reasons. But it should be what I think we are working towards. And so the number of reasons I'm going to go into in my next schematic. So this is and this is not that beautiful, but it's what I'm calling the learning buckets of Power BI. And so just because I am impressed with how much you have to know to understand Power BI. And, really on the back end, let's say you're not going to have a data warehouse, nothing like that. But on the back end, even if you're going to do what Mark did, you are going to want to do star schema modeling. So whether you do that, your ETL is in Power Query, or whether you've got professionals doing, back end ETL for you, you are still going to have to get good at this, whoever you are, the organization. I'm talking really the organization. And what kind of skills does that involve? It involves like figuring out the grain of the fact table. That is not trivial. Trust me, I've been working with with a really big electric company that provides electricity, and the grain of their tables is literally one row per 15-minute interval per installation of a meter, which is incredibly voluminous data, right? So of course there are issues with that kind of large model. So you have to figure out what are the grain of the roll-ups you're going to do. How do you conform your dimensions? Those themselves are you need to know a fair amount before you make those decisions. And then there's the whole issue of, okay, what happens when you have a many-to-many? Who's going to know how to build a many-to-many architecture? Because it's not trivial, right? There's some complexity there. Budget to actual, which Mark just made look really simple, but it's actually pretty complicated when you get to the mixed grain and trying to write DAX around that. So, even these things like what kind of fact table should it be? Should it be a transaction accumulating snapshot, a periodic snapshot? The things like slowly changing dimensions in your ETL. All of this back-end stuff, you don't have to be, tremendously accomplished in to start to get value out of Power BI. But if you're an enterprise, that skill set, and you want to really use Power BI across the board, those skills are going to be necessary to have. So that's just one, back end. The model build out and maintenance is going to include, DAX. You're going to really have to know DAX. I mean, it's a really interesting question of Ron and I. Ron, you can pipe up if you want. We are constantly having this battle about, how much can you get value out without knowing very much DAX? And, there is tremendous, especially if you do a lot of the back end work really well, there's tremendous amount of leverage you can get from very simple DAX. The only problem is that when you will run into, at least I have run into invariably, in organizations, the one measure that they really care about is complicated. It's the one measure that's going to, give them insight that they haven't had before. And that measure maybe require you to understand advanced DAX. So DAX is, we all know what DAX is. It takes a while to learn. Power Query M. This is, well, I won't say much about M. It is, you can go really the full yardage of being an ETL developer, basically, if you know M really well. So it's incredibly powerful. These other two things are serious learning curves. Row level security, and I wouldn't say deployment of actually, what I tried to do is make the red the things that are really hard or really require a fair amount of investment to learn. And row level security is that. Row level security can be extremely simple, can be very sort of static and, just literally based on a region or based on a department, but it can get really tricky when it gets dynamic and when you have hierarchies. So, that's a big element that you have to understand. Also, this way of doing pipeline source control, dev test prod, that they have a deployment pipeline in Power BI. I think it's only premium, but nevertheless, that deployment pipeline is a really powerful mechanism for making sure that you are staying within certain guardrails as you do development. And it's really important to incremental refresh, by the way, because if you can sort of do incremental refresh without losing changes that you've made to stuff that you've got in a more advanced bucket. So you need to understand a little bit about how that whole chain of source control works in the development process for model build out. So just speeding up a little bit, this other side of the screen, optimization and performance, in my experience, is really, you have to have a certain depth of exposure to DAX Studio. You might be using Tabular Editor to do, certain things, doing bulk changes, things like that. But you're going to have to also understand, corporate composite models, which I'm just going to put a pitch in because I've just been working on composite models for the past few weeks, and they are really fun. They are, they're really exciting because if you have a situation where you have big data volumes and you have really strained performance, it's amazing to see how slick composite models is. So I would really encourage.
Terminology-wise, Rachel, you kind of took me to school.
Oh,
I think
right.
today, right? So
Right.
composite models is when you're using the mix between the direct query and import mode. And so many times I kept thinking of composite models, when we were waiting for the December release of being able to do mashup models where, you're live connecting to a data set and then you're bringing your own data or whatever. That's called direct query against a data set.
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
composite is very specific.
I think what happened is in the first few weeks, they named composite models, or the first week of that release, they called it composite model again, which was confusing. And then they went to change it that it's direct query against analysis services and Power BI data sets. But yes, thank you, Greg, for that call out, because composite models are really ones where you actually go in and you have this huge volumes of data. You go in and you build aggregate tables and you kind of roll them up, and then you tell Power BI, okay, I want you to look at this measure, and then basically it matches this other measure or it matches this other aggregation in the larger table. And then the engine is really smart enough to figure out which should it go after the aggregate table or should it go after the direct query table, which is going to, directly query your SQL Server or whatever. Anyway, it's really cool. So, and it's not, I don't find it intimidating to learn, just so
And
you
it
guys
saves your
know.
data set size, right? I mean, you had
Oh,
a
yeah.
data set over one, almost hitting that 1 gig limit. If you're hitting these data set limits, think about going composite model and where you can save yourself by, picking some tables that to go direct query, so you're not bringing that all up into the cloud.
Yeah. So anyway, but everything to do with optimization and performance, which can really kill the party if your speed is not good, has to do with all of this stuff with star schema model design, but also has to do with, understanding how to optimize stuff, which is DAX related and compression related and stuff like that. So that's another learning bucket. In case you're getting depressed, don't worry about it. All of this is basically available, for free on the web if you just have the time to do it. And then there's so visualization best practices. Of course, we know that's kind of, that's an effort to do as well. But lastly, also there's this whole area which is not. I didn't make it red because it's not really that hard, but you have to think about it. Which is Power BI admin, how you set up your workspaces, how you do your governance. Do you do data sets? Do you do certified data sets? Do you do sensitivity labeling? How do you set up your permissions in workspaces? So I'll talk a little bit about that more. That's not really difficult to do, but it is a tremendous amount. And I like this quote that somebody said, which is governance is 99% communication, which means it's not a typical IT project, right? It means a lot of conversation back and forth about permissions and who can do what and how you should set up your tenant. So that's a whole nother area. So one of the things that even if you're just going to do modeling, just to know for modeling, what you need to know to understand star schema is actually not just star schema. You have to understand DAX because you need to understand, how are your aggregations done? What are you going to be able to do in DAX? So I'll give you a very specific example. I work a lot with a guy named Brian Boswick, he's a CSG guy, and he does the back end ETL, does a lot of SQL, and he's just amazing. And we work together a lot to decide what is the grain of this table going to be? How complicated, what is he going to take in terms of the complexity load, and what am I going to take in terms of the complexity load? And the interesting thing is, because I know DAX, I know that I can do aggregations within the DAX that allow me to do, that can be done at a higher grain that are done in the actual tables that I'm going to bring in. So just knowing that, and I would really recommend that you really avoid this, but that you can do measures on dimensions. You can use cross-filtering in the DAX itself if you don't want to use bidirectional filters, which I'd also recommend. But there's also, there's a lot of implications of how complex the design is, in terms of, are you going to use Snowflake in your model, and how is DAX going to handle many-to-many? So I'm not going to read all of these points, but the idea is that if you look at sort of what you need to know when you're designing, what kind of fact tables are you going to have? What kind of dimensions are you going to have? How are they going to relate to each other? You need to understand DAX. Oops. You need to understand, there's actually a way to make this a straight line. You need to have RLS knowledge. You need to know going into the discussion, how complicated is the security? Because if it's trivial, if it's static, then that will have a lot of implications for how you set up your dimensions. If it's not, that is also something you're going to have to know before you really complete your model design. You're also going to have to know optimization, the kinds of things you don't want to have, bad performance, and of course, to do the design, you're going to have, really good ETL knowledge. If you're really going to be, if you're really doing an enterprise data warehouse or enterprise data models, you're going to want to know, how do I do multiple passes of the logic? What can I do that can happen in, how do I do a slowly changing dimension? What can happen inside the ETL? What should happen inside the ETL, as opposed to happen later downstream? So, so basically, these are the kind of steps that are involved in doing star schema design. From model storming, which is, just basically a way of getting out of your business users' heads. What are the dimensions? What are the facts? What are the events? What are the kind of who, what, when, where, why, how categories that you want to have? To selecting the model, the fact types, the grain, conforming the dimensions, figuring out how you're going to do bridges and snowflakes if you're going to need them, and also if you're going to do aggregations and composite models. So that's a lot of stuff. I mean, it's interesting because I would rarely go, actually, I would probably never go into an enterprise engagement without having a really good ETL guy. If we were doing a big data warehouse, without having a really good ETL guy who really knew his world or her world about what's possible and what's limited in ETL. And I think at this point, Brian, it's fair to say he'd be reluctant to go into that without me knowing the kind of DAX and optimization kinds of issues. So, okay, so I could pause and take a break here. The next thing is a little bit of a dense picture. Does anybody need to say anything or want to ask a question?
Questions, comments, experiences? I know we've been kind of going off on in the chat a little bit.
Is there a little chat happening? I don't even know. Okay. Quiet crowd. Okay. So let me just talk about the kinds of roles that you need to think about if you're an enterprise. This is, again, really detailed, but basically, even if you don't create all these roles, and you guys have probably heard of this, it's kind of enterprise deployment 101 for business intelligence. You need, a data steward, you need data architects, you need developers, you need, champions. And what I don't have on here is that you need a, upper level corporate sponsor, right? So what's interesting is that even if you're a small organization, you will have to have all these roles. What I thought that was really interesting, and again, this was from the Microsoft slide, these two roles here, Power BI admin, Power BI capacity admin, they basically are really different in a way. They are sort of the Power BI capacity admin, especially if you're a large enterprise and you're doing premium, you really have to know how to manage capacity. That's not an issue so much if you're not using premium, but the Power BI admin person is really the one that's doing, sorry guys, I'm still learning how to do this, is really doing, sort of all this coordination, assigning PBI licenses, figuring out how to monitor the service in the gateway, all of the tenant settings, which is incredibly important, actually, because tenant settings are where you decide a multiplicity of governance policies. Do you let somebody download a PBIX file? I mean, that may seem like a trivial question, but in fact, there's a lot of power in being able to download an import PBIX file and basically, have your way with it, right? So that's just an example of an admin tenant setting, which, has a lot of ramifications. And so this person has to be responsible for the execution of that, presumably working with a team that's kind of coordinating on what those policies would be. Another interesting, hold on one sec, let me go a little bit. These other roles, the data info security manager. So even, like I said, if you only have 3 people, somebody has to be thinking about information security. Somebody has to know about, what's going where and how are we going to enforce the policies and who has access to back-end data, right? All the way down the chain, right down to the SQL tables. What kinds of permissions are you going to set up in that whole pipeline? So that may be the same person as the data steward, but probably not. The data steward is probably more from the business end. So, it's those kinds of things about no matter how big you are, you need to think that the jobs need to get done, whether or not you have the multiple roles. Architect, BI developer, you guys probably don't need to, I can share these after, but, sort of PBI champion, my own experience is that actually this is critical. Completely, might be underpaid, but underplayed as to how important that is. But the BI champion is really the person who everybody goes to and who carries the adoption forward. So the BI champion has to have tremendous visibility. They're kind of like the Greg of our user group. They're the person who is really advocating for it, thinking of every opportunity to take the results of the work that people have done and advertise it. I think that a lot of people don't really, a lot of people that do analytics and BI work, we like to build, basically. We don't necessarily like to go out and talk about it and show it off and try and find other opportunities for it. And really, your BI champion has to do that as well. So you got to think about all these roles. Do you have them? Do you have the skills? How are you going to cultivate them in-house, And as you're doing some kind of enterprise deployment, this is another, make this a little bit bigger. So you want to think in terms of phases, I think. You could, so I didn't fill out phase 2, phase 3. I was actually working on this with a customer, but basically in the phase, there are multiple aspects. I think you can see that I really was kind of into swim lanes this year. Swim lanes is kind of my thing, right? So I'm seeing a lot of swim lanes. Anyway, architecture, roles, project management, scope, governance, dimensional modeling. And for each of these swim lanes, there's a lot of stuff you need to think about. So if you're a large organization, you need to think about, well, are we going to be cloud or on-prem for our backend? That's a big thing. Are you going to go Azure Synapse? How big do you need your data repository to be? Do you need a data lake? Do you, should you learn about Azure Synapse? Should you just settle for an Azure SQL database? What kind of volumes are you looking at? Data Vault is not something we've probably talked about much in this meetup, but it's basically, I don't want to say it's a competitor to Kimball. It's a different way. It's kind of like often you would, it's a different way of modeling your data. And I've never done a Data Vault engagement, so I really can speak only superficially. But it is a way of capturing data so that you are you almost snapshotting it a lot, which is great for historical audit. So if you're a firm that is doing maybe commodities trading, it would be really good to have that kind of audit ability in your data. So another thing you can think about is, do you need data warehouse automation? There are tools like Warescape and other data warehouse automation tools that speed up the amount of how quickly you can do your database, your data warehouse build out. So, so there's a lot of that you want to think about kind of in phase 0. And then in phase 1, in terms of architecture, are you going to use certified data sets, live connect, or data flows? I'll actually show you, I have a schematic this is way too small to see, but basically, this is kind of one-stop shop for a lot of the decisions that you need to be thinking about when you are deciding. So this is kind of, I won't go through all of this, but on-prem or or cloud. Large organization, do you want to do premium or do you want to do pro? Do you want to do certified data sets? Do you want to do SSAS? Do you want to have complete control and governance? Then you might use, get built report server and do nothing in the cloud at all. So you have a lot of these different options, including, this is the one that I actually end up referring to most, which is this decision of whether to do either, if you're going to do analysis services or certified data sets with live connect reports or data flows, or even just let people go crazy and do their own non-certified data sets. All of those things are things that you need to think about. Even the question of what gets who says when something could get published to a workspace, and who says when an app can be released. I mean, these are just stuff that your team that's doing this rollout needs to have at least in the vision while they're, considering it. So that's what this sort of phases thing is about, like who's going to do these roles, let's train them in how to do Agile so that we can work together. What's the scope of our enterprise? Are we doing you know, a lot of POCs that are going to win hearts and minds? Are we doing, you know, we're just doing, let's just start on a model that we know that everyone's going to use. And I also will say, because I think about this a lot, is, you know, do you want to do a model where it is, you know, like a mothership model? We tend to work with large organizations, and we tend to build some models that are kind of mothership models, and then we do a lot of, you know, live connects to them. That's pretty much what we will do, certified data sets with live connects. We also will sometimes spin off from that mothership model to make another one that is going to use fact tables that are also in the mothership model, but may introduce other fact tables. And I tell you, you want to make those decisions carefully, because you don't want, as you update one, you're going to have to update the other, right? So would it be wonderful to have one mothership model that every tool in the every PBIX Live Connect report could use? I mean, on the one hand, I could make a case for that, because then there's one place where all that data is really curated, it's audited, it is like super, you know, everything about any change is audited really well. But you get into that problem of low flexibility then, which is the classic complaint about IT. Governance kinds of issues that you need to think about in advance, right? What are you going to be, who's going to be able to create workspaces? Do you want to have all your certified data sets in a workspace? How are you going to think about that architecture? And of course, dimensional modeling. You know, do you anticipate having large models? If you do, are you going to think about, you know, composite models? You know, do you need low latency, right? So these are all kinds of streams that need to get people's attention when they're thinking about a Power BI deployment. So I think I would probably stop there and open it up. If there's anybody who wants to comment, I mean, there's the Power BI tenant settings is actually, I'll just show you one last slide, is actually a place where a tremendous number of decisions are made about your governance. And this was just a simple thing I was showing, you know, kind of, okay, if I'm going, what are my governance policies, right down to, does my tenant setting, am I going to allow for, you know, B2B guest users, right? On exporting, am I going to allow people to do all these various forms of export? I mean, one of the things we do in the dyad is we show that there are 7 ways of sharing out of Power BI service. You can export to CSV, you can do a PowerPoint, you can share with just one person, you can, you know, you can add them to the workspace, you can add them to the app. You need to have at least some guardrails in place to think how you're going to do it consistently in the organization. And the tenant settings is a great way to police that, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ron, but it's very trivial to change a tenant setting. I don't think you have a lot of downstream ramifications. That was just a test to see if Ron was still awake. I don't know.
Oh, I'm still here, but I was just thinking about having another beer.
Yeah. I'm sure you are. Okay. Anyway, so anything you want to add about tenant settings, Ron?
Don't give Rachel admin control over the progress tenant.
Good point. I mean, I'd either lock everything down or blow everything wide open, and we don't know the
good
answer.
Question by Lisa is, where are the tenant settings established? I know that might be for the Power BI admins out there, you know, where do you go?
I can show you. So let me. Sign in, because I happen to be actually a Power BI admin on. So under tenant settings, so you have to be a Power BI admin. So let me go to a workspace. Let's just go to demo. Right, that's true. It doesn't really matter. So under here, you guys, can you see that? Admin portal, right? So I click admin portal. And this is like the keys to the kingdom. I'm telling you, watch out. This has everything. This has sort of like who's using what, who your users are, although that's, that's administered. I don't have those keys, sadly. But tenant settings. Tenant settings has like multiple subsettings. So for example, create workspaces. Ron has said, he's actually the tenant god. I just sort of, every once in a while switch a button to see if he's paying attention. But this, like, everybody can create workspaces in our organization, right? We have a lot of workspaces.
About 500 last time I counted.
I mean, he's not kidding. We have a lot. Greg is like a little workspace, chomper, right? He just builds them like crazy. So, you might want to hit disable for that, right? Use data sets across workspaces. This is really critical for having use of Live Connect and certified data sets, right? You giving permissions to that. So, there's this, what I was telling you about the export, that's why, because this was so annoying, that's why I did that visual. But like, publish to web, can you let people do that? Do you have business to business? Allow Azure Directory, Active Directory, so that we can share with amazing people like Chris Weiss. I mean, that's kind of like a lot of stuff that is basically with clicks of buttons determining your governance policy, right?
One comment to make, Rachel, is everybody was really loving your diagrams. So the faster we can get that published, the better. So you can throw that.
I have like a zillion more. I'm like totally into Lucidchart. This is just so because every time I try and explain something, it's just like seems a lot better with pictures. I mean, this is like looking at kind of on-prem versus cloud data store, and like, should you decide, should you keep your data on-prem or should you put it in the cloud? And here's like the pros and cons. Is it going to kill us if we don't move to the cloud later today, later in time anyway? So yeah, thank you. I really enjoy kind of trying to get these, in a way, one of the things that we sort of have to talk to people about is, do you want to be cloud or on-prem? And it's not just in terms of data stores. Like, are you going to have your landing and star schema in, local databases, or are you going to use, Azure Data Factory and Data Lake? But it has to do with the semantic layer too. Are you going to use Azure analysis services if you're going to use, if you're not going to use Power BI as certified data sets, you're going to use that. But also, you pretty much stuck with a cloud for distribution. So yeah, there's all these questions that you have to hold in your head. So I have found that having pictures makes it a lot easier for people to be able to listen to you, in terms of not get overwhelmed. So.
Thank you, Rachel. Does anybody have any questions? I know we're a little over time and people have to jump. We'll take a couple questions before we break. Let's see, I think, Kirill, did you raise your hand? I'm waiting for my teams to switch over.
Yeah, I did. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Kirill.
Hey, so my question is around, I know how you talked about having sort of a mothership model, right? But yeah, in practice, we really rarely see that, right? It's just kind of where BI gets pushed out is out of these departments and department initiatives. Just the question is around how successful and how hard do you really push that towards that one mothership model? You just like, where do you stop?
It's I guess that I want to say I'll just give you an example in healthcare that'll maybe help. In healthcare, like, two really critical fact tables are visits and charges, right? So people came and we charged for that. Those two, we always have that mothership model in almost any healthcare situation we do. We almost always will have a model that will have those two fact tables together and all their dimensions around it, and also often appointments, what's scheduled, right? Because then they can see no-shows and stuff like that. Yep. So there are certain things that really are so core to a variety of departments, that I tend to promote that as a mothership model. There's a satellite model maybe for surgery where all they care about is the actual surgery case, which may be different than a visit, right? And then, you know, Bastian will go off and make a brilliant surgery data model. But I'm always like a little nervous because, you know, if I change a dimension here and he's not keeping up in that model, that's a problem, which is an argument for data flows, I mean, in a way. So.
And I'm thinking then the common dimensions as well, right? But the facts you kind of leave to their own departments if they're not relevant all across the board.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Any other questions? I think everybody wants to probably have their evening to themselves at this point. Yeah. Rachel, thank you so much for the last minute jumping on and having such a great talk. If everybody could just come off mute and give her a round of applause.
Nice job, Rachel.
Thank you.